Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video, I wish to talk to you about comments. You know, all these, well, I'm not even sure if such a word exists in English, but let's say shitstorms in comments, you know, this eternal classic of the internet. So, you know, all those epic fights of highly intelligent individuals, if you know what I mean. So, a very simple fact, I believe, about those competitions or arguments or whatever, is that they almost never, or let's say, at the absolute minority of them end in compromise, right? So, basically, in all my life, I've only seen like maybe several episodes of that sort, you know, when people actually agreed on something. And I mean, after some prolonged argument, let's say, and it always looked like, you know, some Christmas evening at the window, you know, with those fancy patterns of frost lit by festive lights or something. So, it was always something very rare and intimate in some way, and even though perhaps all the participants of this event felt the same more or less, but hopefully you get the point. So it's an exception rather than a rule, let's say. So I would claim that in general the change of opinion, it certainly happens in human beings, but it happens usually after some, you know, prolonged period of quiet, calm introspection, let's say, of some, in some way, some renegotiation with yourself, because, well, in a way, all of your opinions are justified by some of your motives, I would say, but or rather by some of your sub-personalities, you know, some of your instincts. Like, let's say, you might hold an opinion, so basically your opinions are only these screens that you show to the world, but they are really supported by something else inside you, basically. That's the point. Like, you might hold a certain opinion because of the, let's say, your respect to some person. Like, this person holds this opinion, you respect the person, and you think, well, probably they are correct, or rather, I would hold this opinion just because I respect them, and I want to be like them, you know, all these affectionate feelings, etc. So, you kind of feel some positive emotions towards the opinion, and you tend more to adopt it yourself. So that's how it works, more or less, and there's nothing bad about it. It's just how human beings behave. Like you want to be like people who you adore, although it's kind of tautological. But anyway, so you have your own, let's say, motivations to hold that opinion or another. So it's clear from that you know, all these war on comments wouldn't probably change your opinion. So in order for you to genuinely change your opinion, you would have to restructurize yourself first and foremost. So you would have to renegotiate between your own instincts to, let's say, hold another opinion instead of the previous one, because, well, this is the new norm, so to speak, for you, right? But obviously, if you're engaged in this situation of war in comments, you wouldn't do that. I mean, like, all of your instincts act as a whole in this sense, right? Because you feel like you're being attacked. Something wants to restructurize you artificially, so to speak. So it's not that you're doing that on your own volition, so to speak. So obviously you would assume this defensive stance against it and would try to shoo it away. So it's very clear that you know, these kinds of like aggressive arguments on the internet, they don't really lead to any type of change in opinion. I mean, if you genuinely think they could and kind of aggressively push your agenda forwards. So yeah, so basically the arguments on the internet are not about convincing your opponent, but I would say the goal you might pursue, I mean, by engaging in those arguments, is to rather better delineate your own point of view, let's say, better argumentate your point of view, sort of like test it against, you know, something hard, sort of test your mettle, or how do you call it, something like that. And perhaps meet like-minded people also. Why not? So in some sense, you might actually ignore the opponent altogether, just directing your message to, you know, anonymous readers, whoever they might be. I mean, in the, well, let's say, in an attempt to gain allies, roughly speaking. So, because, again, the argument on the internet is not something intimate. Again, it's something public. The internet is a public space, you know, almost like a street or a park or a public transport or whatever, or a cafe or whatever. So whatever you do on the internet, I mean, if it's in the open channels, like a comment section under YouTube video or in Facebook or whatever, it's being by default exposed to a lot of people, right? A lot of anonymous people. So you're talking not only to your opponent, but also to this absolute majority, actually, you know, the absolute majority of people who are participating in your discussion with your opponent are not even represented in this discussion, you know. So your opponent is really only one person out of, let's say, 1,000 who would read this thing that you wrote there. So you have to keep that in mind. So, and again, the analogy I hope is pretty clear. Like, if you start an argument, like a loud argument in a cafe, like there's going to be at least like maybe 10 people hearing that, and they would kind of be participants of this act, even though they aren't actually engaged in it, right? And so the situation is quite the same in this case. So from that, I mean, from those two previous points, like the first point is that you can't actually convince anyone in this sort of engagement, and the second point is that you're actually mostly talking to anonymous observers rather than your immediate opponent. I think it's pretty clear from those 2 points that you should make your arguments as clear, polite, well, let's say, adequate and correct as possible, like as precise as possible, you know. And actually, I'm not sure like what the legal situation is in other countries, but in my country, if you like insult somebody on the internet, you can actually have legal consequences for that. So that's another thing to keep in mind, like, you know. Well, again, in my country, like, the only thing that's keeping, you know, all those bullies, etc., from getting, let's say, from getting their share of consequences is the laziness or the lack of effort of their opponents, you know. Like, if you really want that, you can easily sue whoever like calls you some bad words or something like that. So that's another thing to look out for, I guess. So basically, you have to, or at least let's say, it would be good if you would be kind of precise and adequate and polite, even with bullies and stupid people, because again, you're not really talking to them, you're talking to the internet, which is like infinite, potentially at least. So, and here, I believe in the arguments on the internet, all the regular rules of logic and rhetoric also are applicable. Like, let's say, there's no point in making these ad hominem arguments, you know, like appeal to the person, like to your opponent, or I mean to the person of your opponent, or to your own. Like there's no point in visiting their page on Facebook and trying to find some flaws in them, you know, to kind of mention that in your discussion or whatever. That's like a golden classic, at least in the Russian-speaking internet. I'm not sure about the English-speaking internet, but I think people are more or less the same in this regard there. So, and there's no point in bragging, like trying to invoke your own authority in order to support your point of view. It's also really not very healthy, let's say. So, and basically there's no point in again invoking any sort of personality in the dialogue, because any sort of reasonable and bright person who would observe that, and hopefully you want these people to be on your side, they wouldn't like that, because they would clearly see that, well, that's some rubbish argument. I mean, you're just a piece of shit, basically. You're telling the other person that they're wrong because they are old and bald and have no success with women or something. Like it's not really a reason for them to be wrong, you know. It's might be something completely irrelevant. They might have a good point, I mean, per se, rationally, right? So, etc., etc. So, well, hopefully it's more or less clear what I just said. So, everything that is not related to the topic should be ignored, basically. That's what I'm saying. And often, you know, all those insults are made sort of casually in the meantime, like in the middle of the sentence, so like a few words, like, well, you know, you stupid piece of crap, blah, 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 something like that. But again, that should be ignored. That's the best way to deal with it. Like, just don't react to it. You know, I've had an aphorism, which at some point I would post in on my page in Facebook, Eugene the Philosopher. It's just that I post everything in chronological order, and I'm not even sure when this particular aphorism was written. Probably it's not going to surface for maybe another year or so. So the aphorism is read like, the most unbearable conversationalists are the ones who don't notice insults, you know, because, well, what is an insult? It's like a provocation. It's like a poke, you know. So it's designed to make you notice that, basically. It's designed to provoke a reaction in you. And if people like see that their insults do not influence you in any way, they just get super irritated and angry, and like, you know, all kinds of sort of demons kind of surface from their souls, so to speak, and kind of consume themselves, actually. I mean, those people, because, well, they see that they have no power over you. And by the way, like, since I'm kind of prone to invoking this Nietzschean idea of will to power, maybe I should try to, every now and then, let's say, give some examples. So provocation is a really good example of that. Like, it can be seen really clear here, even though arguably I would say any type of social interaction, you can explain it in the language of will to power. But in terms of provocation, like, when you provoke somebody, you basically kind of, again, kind of poke them and expect some reaction, right? And if they react, you're filled with joy. That's the whole point of trolling, right? I provoke you because I know that I'm trying to like hit your sensitive spot to kind of provoke some sort of outrage or some other reaction, maybe even compassion or something. Like, well, okay, that's a separate topic. Let's stick to this one. So when I provoke you, I expect some reaction from you, and if you give this reaction to me, I feel my power over you. So I was able to control you in some sense, to make you my puppet by provoking this reaction in you. It's like having a button, you know, I click the button and you jump, let's say. That's my power over you, right? So I can troll you, like provoke you, and you will do whatever the heck you're doing in this case, right? And I feel this sort of this visceral response, like I feel I'm controlling you, right? I'm pushing this button and you jump. I push the button again and jump again. That's a very simple way of looking at those things. And again, I've kind of tried to digress into this area, but I probably should, because it's pretty important. Like the people who are, let's say, demonstrating their own misery to other people, or well, let's say like the paupers on the street or something like that, or people who make, you know, self-harm, like they intentionally damage themselves. What they're doing is they're trying to demonstrate other people that they have power over them. And it might sound ridiculous on the surface, but if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Like, well, let's say a child tries to show to their mother that they have control over them. I mean, the child has control over mother. So a child knows that mother kind of cares about them, well, hopefully at least. So a child might damage themselves, like cut their arm or something, like intentionally, to make mother suffer. So a child has power over their mother in this sense. Like they might damage their mother by damaging themselves, and they sometimes, in some circumstances, they're happily doing that. So this is exactly the same thing. And again, the paupers or disabled people on the street who, you know, ask for change or something, they kind of utilize the same mechanism. They know that perceiving misery invokes negative emotions in people, and they, well, on some level, I would say they enjoy this power that they have. They enjoy the power of bringing misery to other people because, well, at least that's some power they have, right? They cannot really make other people happy because they are miserable themselves, they don't have any resources, etc. But at least they might make other people suffer. And that's their, let's say, channel of influencing other people, their channel of projecting their power onto other people. So there's a really, and I think in my video, Bad Ending, I talked a little bit about how the feeling of increase in power actually is equivalent to the feeling of joy. So yeah, more or less, that's what I'm talking about. But I'm sorry, that was a huge digression. Hopefully the last one, but I'm pretty sure it's not the last one. So yeah, so what was I talking about? Yeah, so don't react to insults, don't react to provocations, because if you don't react to provocation, that's actually a provocation of its own, if you think about it. Like, the person was expecting some response from you, but you didn't show any response, and in some sense, you might think about it that your power has increased because of that, because, well, you effectively considered this other person so small and insignificant that you don't even have to react to whatever they're doing. It's like a small insect, you know, a small bug, even though they're kind of irritating. But if you don't react to them, you kind of demonstrate sort of self-coherence and self-control and ultimately a power, at least over yourself. Like, if you don't react to things you don't want to react to, you're in control of yourself, which means you are very powerful. You're a very solid, you know, strong human being, essentially. Yeah. So basically, ignore everything which is not related to the topic. Try not to go sideways, because really that saves a whole lot of time and effort. And because otherwise, if you don't do that, you might encounter the problem of what I would call inflation of the dialogue. and like it's this infinite expansion of the dialogue, where like we'll just imagine a video with cute kittens, where like, and that's the property of internet more or less, where under a video with cute kittens just spontaneously generate like a million of comments about, you know, of a very specific content, let's say, like comments about of a very distinctive character, comments about Hitler, feminism, like gay marriage, abortion, vegans, flat earth, like we was kangs, or something like that. And obviously all of that intermingled with you know, mutual abuse and insults. And it's actually not a joke, what I just told you, because I saw those situations, like literally a movie about cats, like a small video clip, and in the comments, like you could have seen, like by the notification of the social network, vk.com, it was like 3,000 comments before that, and those comments, those particular ones were about like, well, it was about, you know, Ukraine, Crimea, this Novorossiya thing, etc. So, yeah, it really happens in real life. So that's the inflation I'm talking about. But another digression probably is that, well, I think I've already mentioned that perhaps in the video about terrorism. I'm not sure, but it was very curious for me to observe like 2016 American elections, because all the media thing and social media, let's say, wars and comments about this election was exactly identical. Like the whole phenomenon was exactly identical to the Russia versus Ukraine wars and comments in 2014. It actually started earlier in late 2013. So I went through that. I was let's say, a veteran of a comment war of 2014 between Russia and Ukraine, and it was really crazy. I mean, people were just hating, like honestly hating each other. And it was very intense. And even in 2015, it was still pretty intense. But in 2016, it was already kind of relaxing into nothingness, more or less. So I've observed the very same pattern emerging in the US like 2 years later, and it was quite strange for me to see that from the side, you know, already being through that, kind of observing the same thing, like reasonable people engaging in the same stupid activity that I was engaging in like 2 years earlier. So yeah, that was kind of funny. But yeah, basically that's what the internet does to you. You have your echo chamber because, well, you surround yourself with people who are pleasing to you, because why would you need people who displease you around you, right? But the nature of the internet is such that you're constantly engaged with other people who are maybe not so pleasing to you, right? So it's this constant contrast between people who like you and people who don't like you, right? And for them, it's the same contrast because, well, they don't like you, but they like their people, right? So it breeds this constant competition. I don't know, something like that. And I think it's in a way it's analogous to the epoch of colonization. You know, you might draw this type of analogy, like basically we've had isolated continents, well, more or less, and then when, well, let's say Columbus supposedly, like, you know, discovered America, even though it wasn't him, and blah blah blah, who cares? So we've had this epoch when these very different cultures were able to actually communicate with each other. So it was a completely different epoch, and it brought a whole lot of suffering and a whole lot of problems. Of course, it also brought some good stuff, but anyway, that this is kind of what we have with the internet, is this connectivity increase, right? Which also drives some negative emotions with it, obviously. But okay, so I would say that a good indicator of, let's say, of the fact that whether you're going in the right direction in your particular conversation or not would be the length of the message, the length of your comment. Because if you're engaged in this sort of discussion with somebody, or discussion, let's say, if your arguments, if your messages become increasingly shorter, it's a good sign. It's a very good sign. It means that like the positions of both parties, let's say, are clear, understood, and there's like increasingly less and less that's needed to clarify, increasingly less and less that's needed to note, let's say. So it's like a attenuating oscillations, you know, it's moving to a stop, so eventually it would stop, right? So it's a sign that you are evading this sort of inflation, where, you know, a small provocation breeds like a lot of negative emotions, and then it just, you know, spirals into this hell under this small video with kittens. But if your messages tend to increase in size, it's actually a bad sign. I mean, after some initial, you know, sort of establishment of positions occurred. It means that either they're provoking you and you succumb to this provocation, or maybe your arguments are really weak, and so you require a lot of hand waving, you know, to kind of shoo the danger away, so to speak, or perhaps you're just talking some rubbish which doesn't have any relation to the topic, which is also bad. Again, you're talking to the internet, you're not talking to that person. So if the internet sees you talking rubbish, well, the internet wouldn't think much about you. So think about it. And of course, well, you might say, well, who cares about the internet? But, well, it's your window to the world, really. I mean, well, most of the people are on the internet today, and perhaps even most of the people you might like are on the internet. So, yeah, go figure. Well, okay. So, there are some tricks, I would say, that you might utilize. They're kind of dirty tricks in logical sense. So, in the sense of logic, they're not really helping you to argumentate your position, but in real case of such an argument on the internet, they might actually help you. So at least help you to, again, escape this sort of inflationary situation. And one of those tricks is focus on only one of the arguments of your opponent. So let's say your opponent says, well, you're wrong because this and this and this and this. And you just completely ignore everything else and just focus on one of those arguments and just like focus on it and just attack there. Especially if you know that they are actually wrong, if you have a good, you know, something to back your opinion up with. And it's actually a very, let's say, ancient principle of warfare. And it's called defeat in detail, you know, when, well, basically it's incredibly simple. You just focus your forces and strike, like, well, the whole idea of focusing your forces is to gain superiority, right, to gain advantage. And you just strike in one of the points. Like, let's say the opponent has their forces, like, homogeneously spread, but you kind of gather all your forces in one huge blob and just attack in one point. So that would lead you to victory because, well, the opponent wouldn't be able to defend this point. So it would shatter, and then you would be able to attack the other portion of their army, let's say, and shatter it too, and then the rest of it and shatter it too, etc. So, and it has been utilized for like thousands of years. Like, if you look at Napoleon campaign in Italy, for example, so if you look at it like strategically, Napoleon had less troops than Austrians had, but if you look at each separate battle, Napoleon always had superiority. So he was able to outmaneuver the Austrians just, due to some superior logistics, etc. So he had a superiority in each separate combat. So he succeeded, well, at least in most of them. I'm not sure if it was all of them. So he won the war, essentially. And the same thing was done by many, many other military commanders, like Frederick the Great, like Stonewall Jackson again. And the very famous one was, damn, that's such a long digression. But anyway, the other one, a very famous one, is Epaminondas of Thebes, the Greek commander who actually defeated the Spartans. Spartans, they're like super warriors. Who can defeat them? Well, some random dude from Thebes defeated them. Well, actually, this whole thing about Spartans being really good warriors, it's just a piece of propaganda, essentially. The Battle of Thermopylae was a pretty cool piece of propaganda because there's a pretty solid evidence that Leonidas actually knew that they would die, and he deliberately took not very large, army with him, like only these proverbial 300 Spartans. I would make a video related to that topic, but anyway. So it was a piece of propaganda. Well, what Sparta was really famous for always was women, actually, like Helen of Troy. Where was she from? From Sparta, obviously, because, well, that's where the best women are from. And although perhaps this is also a piece of propaganda, because in Sparta they had this weird system where it was the wife who inherited all the wealth of a husband if husband died. And obviously husbands died all the time because they've had wars all the time. I mean, it was just what Greeks did at that time, not just Spartans. So they've had a lot of those women who got incredibly rich because their husbands died. And since this system persisted, some of them actually accumulated incredible amounts of wealth. So Sparta was really governed by those super wealthy widows rather than, some whatever. Damn, I don't even remember how I got here. Oh, it was from Epaminondas. So yeah, Epaminondas, what he did was exactly that, defeating detail. So a usual tactic or at least that's how the legend goes, a usual tactic for the battles of phalanxes was that you just take your phalanx, in a row, and you just attack the enemy's phalanx, right? What is a phalanx? It's just a tight formation of dudes with shields and spears. But what Epaminondas did is just he concentrated a lot of troops on the left flank. Like, it was a really dense, like multiple rows, several columns. But the rest of his phalanx was kind of thin. So he confronted Spartan phalanx, and he easily defeated their right flank. Well, maybe not very easily, but anyway. And yeah, he gained advantage, and he basically destroyed the Spartan army. And basically he destroyed the Spartan state, because maybe not the most, but a huge portion of Spartan citizens were killed in this battle, because obviously you could only be a citizen if you were going to war. Right? So Sparta was destroyed, essentially, due to this principle. yeah, so that was defeat in detail. That was the battle of, I'm not sure about the English pronunciation, Loughtre, I don't know. Loughtra, I would have said. Alright, so that's what you should do with your opponent in the war and comments. You should focus on one of the arguments of theirs. And that would disorient them because, as I've said, it's kind of a dirty tactic. But let's say if they would consider, well, firstly, they would need to defend that somehow, right? They would need to shoo you away from this argument. So that would occupy their thinking processes. But if they would consider that you've missed something important because you've only focused on one argument, they would remind you. So in some way, you're making them do your work for you. You're saying to them, you know, I don't really care about your arguments. I'm just going to focus on this little spot and I'm going to hit you really hard in it. And they would say, well, wait a minute. What about this point? What about this point? And they would try to find the most valid point to kind of throw into you, to kind of shoo you away from this point. You know, it's, well, maybe I'm delusional, but I'm kind of perceiving that in this, on this language of you know, the like blobs of power kind of pressing against each other. And well, again, the analogy of troops is kind of applicable here, I believe. But okay, so yeah, and in this way you would not fall into this problem of inflation. Well, because you're just focusing on one of the arguments and just ignoring everything else, right? So you're making your opponent try to gather these arguments again into something recognizable. You just like again, Alexander the Great. I mean, supposedly he used this wedge, you know, in his cavalry, hetire, or how do you call it in English? Like this wedge just kind of pierces the enemy formation, right? That's what you should do, essentially. Or if you don't do that, you might, you know, like you might quickly end up with this exchange of fire type of dialogue where, you know, frequently what you might see is that the opposing sides sending each other lists, like literally lists, numbered lists, like, oh, 1, like, you're an idiot because blah, blah, blah. 2, you're an idiot because you don't consider blah, blah, blah. 3, you have forgotten about this. 4, you have forgotten about this. And they do that sometimes for days, you know, and it's super boring and it's super lame. And it's like this, you know, trench warfare. It doesn't get you anywhere. It just consumes your emotions, your time, your effort, etc., etc. So again, it's not a good recipe, basically. That's what I'm saying. Or if all else fails, let's say if you cannot think of any decent response, let's say if your limit of tolerance is like overcome. If you've overcome your limit of tolerance, you might just not answer anything at all. That's also an answer, you know. Like, you don't have to answer. That's the most bizarre thing about the internet, is that you do all that voluntarily, and yet you suffer from it, you know, at least sometimes. Like, you don't have to answer. It's not an interrogation, you know, it's some police or court. It's not a taking of hostages type of situation. You don't have to do anything. You basically come there to receive some knowledge, hopefully, or some, I don't know, positive emotions or some thrills. Well, maybe this type of engagement thrills you. Well, in this case, why not to engage in it? Obviously, but in the most general sense, you don't have to answer to anybody, right? So, yeah, you know, and especially if there's nothing more to add, like if you've put your point coherently and like politely and consequently, etc. So let's say the anonymous internet can see that, and then your opponent suddenly starts doing some weird crap, you can just ignore it. Like, the internet has already got your point. That's the most important thing, basically. And as one of the Sun Tzu's principles stated, basically, don't fight where you can't win. You know, if a dirty pig attacks you, there's nothing better to do than run. You know, otherwise you'll get dirty, and you might get hit also. So yeah, just ignore it. Like, try to evade it somehow. So, since I myself probably don't have anything more to add here, I would say that let's finish this video. It actually got much longer than I hoped it would be, but that's thanks to all the stupid digressions. But anyway, thank you for watching. The eons are closing.